This is about to be a deep dive into several trans athletes, ideologies, and hard questions about rights, equity, and inclusion. We're going to cover 100-pound bench PRs for trans athletes, new laws prohibiting trans competitors, and rules the U.S. and certain international sports groups are making, and how they do and don't line up. And of course, asking, is this fair? Is it possible for progress to be bad? Every day it seems there is a new social cause that is at odds with biology, religion, cultural norms, or political agendas, often as clear-cut as slavery, women's suffrage, equal rights in marriage, age of consent, and the creation of child labor laws. We look at these now as so obvious, as injustices, and we are grateful for their correction. We see other countries not adopting them as we have, or revoking these rights, and see them as regressive. This is the magic of hindsight. We see the good decisions we've made historically to help the disenfranchised or extend freedoms, yet it is rare we look at these times progress under the guise of helping other people led to more suffering, led to subjugation of others, or that we were completely misled with false data that made us other people and treat them differently. We demand religious freedom. But in 1980s Uganda, we saw nearly 1,000 people killed under the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments. We have the massacres at Jonestown and Heaven's Gate, or India, where nearly 40% of marriages are child brides, seemingly in accordance with Islam and Hinduism. We've got Emmett Till being tortured and murdered, yes, because of racism, but also because believe all women. Books like The Bell Curve claiming to have data as to why black people commit crimes, and that causing police and legislators to scale the intensity of their efforts against them and increase the severity of their sentencing. Harmless drugs being made to Schedule 1 so that they can protect the citizens, but then these laws being used to arrest people of color and anti-war activists. People now claiming that being a minor attracted person is just a sexuality and that it should be protected. We know religious freedom should exist, but can hardly comprehend mass suicides, child brides, sexual assault victims should be believed, but people shouldn't be murdered or ostracized or sentenced before an investigation is done. Data may be useful for understanding crime statistics, but not when it is used to persecute a whole race. You should be free to love who you love, but we see an obvious limit to this. I hope. The push for tolerance, social justice, and acceptance has its place. And the most contentious of these today is the belief that trans athletes, usually in this case meaning male to female, should be allowed to compete with biological males. They say it is discriminatory to exclude them, but on the other side, people say biological women are being physically harmed, in the case of Fallon Fox, breaking an opponent's orbital bone and getting repeated knockouts, losing scholarships, or not placing high enough to move forward in a competition, in the case of Lia Thomas's former teammates, or being absolutely destroyed with unbelievable powerlifting records, in the case of Andres. Today we are discussing a subject that I believed would be simple, cut and dry, but toward the end, it led me down a very dark rabbit hole that I'm going to save for the end of this video with a big disclaimer that it is extremely disturbing. As always, please comment on YouTube, as it is amazing for the algorithm, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially on a subject like this. There are going to be many video components to this episode, so I'd recommend watching this on YouTube if you're watching it on any other podcast platforms. That way you can glance over at a few points and see some of the clips I've included, but it's not going to be 100% necessary. I'll also be including some conversations with other creators on this topic, but if you don't hear a belief represented that you hold, it's not because I didn't offer, it is because they declined to be recorded, but I'm always open to talking with people about this kind of stuff. So that being said, let's get into it. In early April 2023, Biden proposed using Title IX to stop schools from banning trans athletes from competing as the gender they identify as. At first, you hear that and many may cheer while others groan. Title IX is the law that prohibits sex-based discrimination for schools that receive government funding. If they don't comply with the rules, the government can withhold federal funding. Simple. There are a few exceptions to this, though. It would give universities and K-12 schools the discretion to limit the participation of transgender students if they find that including transgender athletes impacts competitive fairness or potentially leads to sports-related injuries. This has trans individuals very angry as they see this as Biden betraying his promise to protect trans youth. This is, however, what sits at the crux of this decision: a competitive advantage. So I'm going to be covering the most notable examples of this and a few extras, but obviously I'm not going to be able to find every single example. So if there are folks that I don't mention, please leave a comment and I'll go check this out. This is, of course, in contrast to what happened in mid-2022. The International Swimming Federation banned transgender athletes from competition, including the Olympics, after consulting with several experts to discuss whether they had an unfair advantage. This is unless they transitioned before age 12, though there appear to be major drawbacks to this, some of which are very disturbing, so I'll be saving those, like I said, for the very end of this video. Lia Thomas, of course, being the most notable trans swimmer after being the first transgender athlete to win a D1 competition, said this on Good Morning America when approached with data showing that they were, in fact, getting a competitive advantage.
There's a lot of factors that go into a race and how well you do. And the biggest change for me is that I'm happy.
Lia says they are happy. That is an important part of this because it begs the question, whose happiness takes precedence here?
But on March 17th of last year, my teammates and I and other female swimmers from universities around the country were forced to compete against a biological male named Lia Thomas. Thomas was allowed to compete in the women's division after competing as a member of the University of Pennsylvania's men's swim team for 3 years. We watched on the side of the pool as Thomas won a national title in the 500-yard freestyle, beating out the most impressive and accomplished female athletes in the country, including Olympians and American record holders. Whereas just the year before, Thomas at best was ranking in the 400s in the men's category. The next day, Thomas and I raced in the 200 freestyle, which ended up in a tie.
As we saw in that clip a little bit ago, Lia's former teammate was not happy about the inclusion of Lia. They say it put them at a disadvantage as biological women. Several teammates said that, in fact. When talking this through with a pro-trans athlete friend who declined being on camera, they said,
"So a few women will lose. Who cares?"
I said, what would your response be if someone said, so a few trans athletes won't be able to compete? Who cares? And they said,
It doesn't work like that.
it brings me back to what I said at the beginning. Is it still progress if we must subjugate someone else to make room for another? Is that progress? Is that still fair? There will be many topics that I'll ask for your opinions on, but this is something that I really want to hear what people think. Why is this okay, but not the inverse that I asked my friend? Skylar Baylor, another trans swimmer, said this.
In order to exclude the trans women, you have to police all women's bodies, and that will lead to the destruction of the women's category. Trans women are not a threat to women's sports. Transphobia is.
I've already said this, but as I get further into this episode, there will be many examples showing that, yes, there is a threat to fairness as far as women's sports go. If you'd like to hear more about Lia specifically, we cover them a little bit more detailed in episode 22, which I'll link above if you're on YouTube, or just go find somewhere else. What interests me most about the U.S. minimal response to this is how most large sport governing bodies are putting more and more restrictions. World Athletics said they'll be forbidding any male to female athletes from competing against biological females beginning March 2023. They said their previous regulations didn't do enough to remove the retained advantage that male to female athletes were receiving. They said that they're going to be doing some further research with a pretty diverse group, actually, including transgender athletes, to see what can be done moving forward, if anything. There is one exception to this rule, however. As before, any male to female athletes who blocked puberty or began transitioning before age 12 will be allowed to compete, which is in line with Biden's proposal. World Athletics also discussed disorder. They're called disorder of sex development individuals, which I'll just call DSD or intersex from here on. DSD individuals are people whose chromosomes and sex organs don't match, or they have both sets of genitals to some degree, though usually only one is fully intact. DSD people were formerly called intersex, and prior to that, they were called hermaphrodites. I'm not sure why the term keeps changing, as these were all used as medical terms at their time of the most prominent usage. There are some sports that allow DSD people and some that don't. And they all seem to have different exceptions and rules. Honestly, I think if I tried to cover them all, we'd be here for like an unnecessary 10 minutes. So you can look up each sport if you're curious, but basically their solution for DSD people is that they need to suppress their natural testosterone. I think that's unacceptable, personally. But I'm also struggling, once again, to think of a fair alternative. In episode 22, Miles mentioned what he calls the Michael Phelps fallacy, which is when people say,
Well, he had an unusually large wingspan, which gave him an advantage over everyone.
This is mentioned quite often, but that only lent itself to a slight performance increase. And as we know, Michael Phelps wasn't undefeated. We never looked at his natural advantage and said, well, he's going to need to shorten his wingspan. This is what he was born with. He didn't have extra organs or appendages his fellow competitors did not have, so it is, in theory, fair. He is as he was born. But what if you were born with something other competitors didn't have? Is it fair to say you need to remove this or suppress something that is naturally in your body? A fairly famous and unusual example that exemplifies what I'm talking about is Castor Semenya. I hope I said that name right. They are biologically a female, but born with internal testes that gave her quite elevated testosterone levels. She is the current women's 800-meter champion. We know that the body works as a system. If you change one hormone, we know other ones change, and we don't know how the long-term impact of intentional hormone changes are going to all play out, with the exception of boosting testosterone, thanks partially to bodybuilders. It could be argued that a DSD individual's entire body has accounted for their naturally elevated levels, and now their whole body functions in tandem with it. If we force them to suppress their levels, in what other ways will it affect them? We know the organs that make up a human, but as shown in the book Biochemical Individuality by Dr. Roger J. Williams, every body is different, and not just in like the special snowflake kind of way, but in very profound ways that I don't think we have any way of really understanding all the implications of. If you're not watching this on YouTube, this is probably where you'll want to switch over, because I'm going to be showing several pictures of each example that I'm going to mention. In 1926, they measured organ weights in rabbits. I'll get to humans next, but bear with me. They saw as much as a 25 times difference in weight. In humans, look at these stomach shapes and sizes. The difference in the entrance points and the exits. Look at this. The difference in the positioning in the gut. Different patterns and shapes of the transverse colon, the sigmoid colon. It's called the pelvic colon here, but yeah, that's what it is. Liver variations, first in size, but then also in placement. Unbelievable changes in the heart, the aortic arch, some so significant that they look like completely different creatures' anatomies. Muscles in people's hands that are absent from others. I'm actually an interesting example of this. I have a sternalis muscle, which is only present in about 5% of people. Dr. Williams even shows this with nerves and, you guessed it, endocrine function and endocrine organs. Again, the book is Biochemical Individuality. I can't recommend it highly enough. But in saying this, we don't standardize these things. Is it only because the presence of an organ that naturally occurred in someone is uncommon in this case? People might hear me say all of this and say like, oh, you're being inconsistent. They'll say I'm not applying this thought process to trans athletes. But again, I'm opting for changes not to be made. I'm not sure how to handle DSD individuals, but maybe some of you watching here are. So if there is data I'm missing, please put it in the comments and I'll make sure to check it out. Hey guys, it's Andrew. I know I just finished talking about this part, but as was very obvious, I still had a lot of questions and things that I wasn't totally sure about. So I wanted to bring someone else in to comment on this a little bit more. I've already mentioned my conversation with Miles several times, but he and I talked briefly about this. And I was like, hey, let's just do a call about this. So, when it comes to intersex or DSD athletes, they're kind of getting a similar treatment as far as transgender people and saying, hey, you need to suppress your hormones. And obviously, I don't necessarily think that that is the solution, or that it's even the same thing. So, yeah, like what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I think the first issue is that one, intersex people who mostly, from my observation, don't want to be referred to as intersex people, are not pawns in the argument for trans inclusion in sport. And lumping them into that category or using people with DSDs to validate trans inclusion in sport is really a nonsensical starting point and really unfair for a number of reasons. Primarily, one being that intersex disorders are almost always sex specific. They either affect males or females. And people with intersex disorders or DSDs aren't freakish half man, half woman hybrids. They can't self-impregnate or ejaculate eggs out of a female penis. Right. They are also defined within the sexual binary construct of male and female. So how those people, and this is the primary case of this, and I don't know if you mentioned it, is Caster Semenya, right. Who's a prominent track athlete. This has been a huge deal in world athletics for the last 5 years or longer, definitely longer. And her participation in female sport with her testosterone levels is not the same argument as a biological male who has had all of the androgynous benefits of testosterone for their entire lives, developmentally, deciding arbitrarily to self-identify as female to participate in female sport. These are two incredibly different problems, and they have to be dealt with incredibly different. So I don't think that the solution that has been, even in Caster's case, I don't think that the solutions that have been put forward in terms of testosterone reduction are the same solutions that need to be applied for the inclusion of transgender athletes. So it really is it's a non-starter. It's a bad place to begin the argument in the first place, because categorically they are incredibly different things and they have to be treated differently, especially out of respect for people with DSDs who don't want to be leveraged for the sake of that argument.
There's one person that I mentioned later on in this video who was born intersex, ended up being raised as a male, and then later in life transitioned to a female. They just said, hey, I always felt more like I was a female. This person also is like very open about the fact of like, hey, I think there is an inherent strength difference. I think there are retained advantages, blah, blah, blah. Like seemingly, I believe in the video, they said, I'm probably one of the more conservative transgender people. In that case, they'll usually say, doctors are just playing God. They look at an intersex person and, they decide, okay, you're a man or you're a woman. And that's not really the case, is it? Isn't it more so that they look at the genitalia that is more intact and then move based on that?
Yeah, because most people with intersex conditions don't have an ambiguous biological sex. And so even in this conversation here, and with this particular individual, who is the exception and certainly not the rule, their intersex condition is not the qualification of what makes them transgender, which, if that was the case, if that's the argument that's being made, it invalidates all of these self-identifying individuals from a gender perspective that do have a clear clear set of biological characteristics. Their self-identification with present intact, normal, and say normal, just categorically speaking, normal biological circumstances, then self-identifying as something else is invalidated by this person saying that their intersex condition is what the ambiguity in their biology is what allows them to kind of move to and fro. Categorically, entirely different than self-identification and participation in sport. And that individual would probably, in that case, as it sounds like they have, because I haven't interacted with this person at all, sounds like they are being honest with themselves and others in saying these aspects of my biology do provide these particular advantages when expressed in these contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they seem to have a very I don't know how I would word this, but they seem to have a fair view of, you know, where they are at in relation to other people. Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation. I link it in this or I'll link it in this video, but I'll send it to you as well. But yeah, outside of that, I mean, do you have any other things that I haven't asked? Any other closing thoughts regarding this, or really anything else that we've talked about?
No, I think that even since we talked last, this discussion has gone beyond where I think we really even expected it to at that time over a year ago, which I think was the concern at the time, that it would begin to take on a more political narrative, and it was not necessarily just about the performance and the scientific implications of trans inclusion in sports. So now we have a very different set of circumstances. I do appreciate that the Caster Semenya example is coming back up, because we largely were discussing that prior to the transgender movement receiving the momentum that it has in the public square now. And so it's being revisited appropriately, and a lot of aspects of that case are being discussed and exposed as also being ridiculous. You know, like when her ruling came out and they started talking about test suppression levels, they were only going to be required for track and field events, I think between the 400 meter and the 1500 meter. So there were only a few categories that were going to be included within those standards. So there's a whole slew of things that has been opened up from that. We have some new rulings that have just come out in the last month as well, from World Athletics, which are big milestones. And there are so many incredibly brave women standing up for themselves and protecting the female space in sport that they have fought very hard to have for a very long time. So I'm excited to see the advancements with World Athletics and the progress that they're making there, as well as some of the other sports. And we're hoping that we'll see more of that in the United States with the Olympic Federation and a handful of other sports.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, hopefully another year from now, we're not having a even crazier conversation, because I really think a year ago when we very first talked about this, I didn't think that it was going to be here, but here we are.
Yeah. I mean, Lia Thomas at the time seemed incredibly fringe, but that is certainly not the case. So I hope that people will continue or begin to actually have a legitimate conversation around this. It seems that a lot of people are waking up to the irrationality of a lot of this, and how it is grossly unscientific. And science aside, it is a gross injustice against women. And that's where I think a lot of the discussion needs to go, and that women need to feel empowered to speak up for themselves and protect the spaces that they've created.
Absolutely. And for all the people listening, it once again is the question that I've said like 5 times in this episode. At what point at what point does it cease being helping someone else and begins to be subjugating someone, putting someone else down? So that being said, Miles, thank you so much for your time. If people want to find you, where do they find you?
Instagram, Miles Brazil, at Miles Brazil. Twitter, at Miles of Musings.
Miles of Musings. All righty. Cool. Well, thank you, sir. We will talk soon, okay?
Look forward to hearing the episode.
Absolutely. I first heard of trans athletes in 2015. There's an exercise called a Kroc row that was popularized by a Marine, a professional powerlifter, and a bodybuilder named Matthew Raymond Kroc. At Matt's peak, competing at 220 pounds. He had a 1,014 pound squat, a 738 bench, and an 810 deadlift. That is a total of 2,551 pounds, over 11 and a half times his body weight. I reference Matt as the first person I was aware of because they now go by Janae Marie Kroc. I remember sitting in my kitchen making a protein shake after a back day, and my friend Zach decided to show me, hey, here's the person who invented the Kroc row, but something was different. Matt was now Janae, a gender fluid individual. Janae is interesting because they have repeatedly said they would never compete in the women's category, and they never have. In 2019, Janae said that they wanted to get their IFBB Pro card in bodybuilding, and several conservative outlets dragged her mistakenly, thinking that she'd be competing against women, which she was not. It is interesting to consider this conversation about trans athletes in regard to bodybuilding because nearly every athlete is on gear already. So anyway, Janae also competes in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but only with men. I don't know if this is because she sees her advantage or if there's some other reason, but I'll read this directly from her Instagram. I have been very clear about the fact that all the records I have broken and all of the championships that I have won in powerlifting were prior to my transition when I was still competing. I've also been very vocal about the fact that I have never competed as a woman, and I have no intention of doing so in the future. And then she says, these are her own beliefs, but they're not necessarily relevant to other ones. It's just her own personal choice. There's a company called Jubilee that had a conversation between trans women and conservative women, which I'll link below, but I do want to show you a few clips from it. If I keep interrupting, it's just because I'm trying to get around some copyright stuff.
How much we give into the feelings of wanting everybody to be accepted, and how much we are willing to do that at the expense of biological women.
As I said earlier, where's the line of being accepting of one person and marginalizing another?
I use myself as an example. This is about how big I was in junior high school and early high school. I used to be able to walk up to a V8 engine block, pick it up off the floor, and set it on a table.
For those who aren't aware, a V8 engine is about 400 to 700 pounds.
And if I was in powerlifting or weightlifting, that amount of, that advantage was just unbelievable. I've been on hormones for 15 years. Did it weaken me? Absolutely.
Just to be clear, this individual is intersex.
Did my bone density really hasn't changed, my muscular hasn't changed. And this is not a binary question. There's a lot of nuances involved.
So they can see a slight decrease in performance, but are still aware of how much they have retained. And I'll need you to remember this specific line for these next two athletes. In 2017, Hannah Mounsey was banned from competing in Australian football by the WAFL. They are 6'2" and over 200 pounds. They didn't begin transitioning until they were 25, and during that time, they stated that they were a very competitive athlete. One of my friends who lives there says they were not, but whatever. Needless to say, many teams saw the size and strength and the competitive advantage of this individual and requested that she try out. There's an interesting clip from a doctor who's also trans, specifically about Hannah.
Prior to her transitioning, she had a V8 motor powering this big muscle frame.
It is kind of funny because this is yet another mention of a V8 engine.
Now she's transitioned and her testosterone level has dropped and her muscle mass has decreased and her strength and stamina has decreased. She's now got a little 4-cylinder engine, so she's actually at a physical disadvantage.
Again, remember this last individual who said they didn't see that significant of a decrease. This in particular annoys me because the doctor then goes on to make all these claims of transphobia when here we are 6 years later, seeing the doctor was in fact wrong. This next guest is Buddy. This is a really unique situation because he coaches cheerleading, where sometimes men and women will actually be working together on one team, and I was curious what his thoughts were about that. being that we most often will think about, men going against other men, women going against other women, what about when they're on a team together? If you want to hear more from Buddy, you can find him on TikTok at NotYourBuddy2 or on Instagram at Buddy Pearson.
I think I have a unique take. I'm not even sure if you know this, but I coach cheerleading for a living.
Okay.
I've done that since 2004, I guess. And so I work with a majority female athletes, minority male athletes, and a smaller minority of trans athletes.
Okay.
So, we're experiencing this as well, where like we're trying to recategorize competitive divisions to include athletes that may present as male or female, because like a biological male presenting as female will have advantages that an all-female team would not have, and things like that. So we're struggling to try to figure that out in our sport. And I think that there's a lot of science that goes into this, and it's not as easy as like they should be able to compete or they should not be able to compete, in my opinion.
Right. So what is it that you, like in your guys' case, what is it that you've ended up doing? Or at least what have you tried out so far? And like, in what ways have you actually seen this, pop up as, I guess, an issue? How have you seen this not be beneficial, I suppose?
It's really hard because we don't have an answer as like an organization yet, in our sport. Not a concrete one. A lot of it has to do with like what that athlete wears. And a lot of people are okay with them competing as what they present as, because obviously like cheerleading has a large LGBTQ community,
Right.
LGBTQIA. I don't want to misrepresent, but
so I'm sure a lot of people would look at cheerleading specifically, and they'll look at it in the context of like, combat sports or football or something like that, where, where there's like intense levels of contact, and they're going to go, oh, why does this really matter? So how have you actually seen it pop up? And I guess if students have been open enough to talk about it, what has their take on it been?
I think a lot of times we have it to where it's in our sport, at least, it's very, very minimal cases right now. Because especially at that age, it's not something that a lot of people are comfortable with, like high school, middle school age. It's not something they're comfortable coming forward with. So a lot of times it comes down to really just what they want to be able to wear. A lot of the males that are want to be able to wear whatever they want to wear, or females going to male. Either way, they want to be able to wear what they want to wear. It's not so much about, they don't mind competing as their biological sex. They want to be able to present as what they identify with.
So sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's a lot different than the issues that we're seeing in like governing bodies like the NCAA and
Right.
like the power talked about. Like I think that there's a big difference in people that are medically transitioning and identifying as.
Right. So being that it is I hope I'm using this word right, it's a unisex sport, like men and women will compete on one team. There's not necessarily a lot of people who are looking at this and being like, oh my God, this is terrible. Like women are getting beaten and this and that, blah, blah, blah. It's mostly a matter of like people deciding, how to present themselves and how to be dressed and stuff like that.
For sure. I think where I think that's why it's not a big deal in our sport,
Right.
is because a lot of what upsets people are when biological women are being removed from their spots because of a biological male presenting as or medically transitioning to their sport, taking scholarships, taking trophies, taking, spots on teams, et cetera. I think that's a big breaking records. So I think that's where a lot of people get emotional about it.
And this next question that we spoke about was, why is it that we are mostly, not only, but I would say the vast majority, seeing biological men stepping into women's spaces and not seeing biological women stepping into male spaces?
I think for a long time, masculine females that were, lesbian, so to speak, it was okay for them to present as masculine. Like there's the stereotypical like ball cap, t-shirt, cargo shorts, like look. And I think that that's been okay forever. Pretty much no one cared because men didn't find them attractive and they didn't see them like as imposing on our spaces and things
Right.
like that. I don't think that has been an issue. And I also don't feel like women transitioning to men, I'm not speaking for them, but I don't feel like they are looking for the recognition as much so as maybe men that are transitioning
Right.
into female. Again, I'm not saying that that's why they're doing it. I believe that they, honestly feel that way. But it doesn't seem that they feel the need, because I think that the feminine male has had to suppress so much more societally. And so when they're able to show that, that's where you see like the term flamboyant in gay men, people that are okay with being more feminine. And so I think when they transition, they want to be seen as female more, whereas the female transitioning to the male is okay with not being seen and just kind of fitting in.
Right. There was as far as like personality traits go, you're familiar with like disagreeableness.
Mm-hmm.
So a really common trait in men is that, they're disagreeable. So I did have someone kind of float the idea, probably one of the reasons why biological men who transition feel more comfortable competing in women's sports is because they're naturally a bit more disagreeable. So they're going to push back and be like, no, I want to do this. I'm going to do this. And women generally are less disagreeable. So if somebody, steps in and says, hey, you can't compete in this, they're probably a little bit more inclined to naturally just be like, okay, then I won't. Like, there's probably not going to be as much pushback from them just naturally because of how they are.
Yeah, I mean, competitive nature, and that's driven a lot by our hormones, testosterone, things like that. So I think that, like I said, with the numbers, like being able to have like 300 nanograms per deciliter of testosterone in your body as a competitive female probably drives a little bit more of that competitive, disagreeable, all those kind of things. I mean, I'm sure guys that are on the testosterone replacement therapy that are, sitting around at 50 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter number there's a lot more energy there. A lot of times you'll get like, you're not roid rage, so to speak, but like
I get what you mean now.
Competitiveness like probably comes with more testosterone, which is again, probably why we see that. And if you're on, testosterone for the first time, there's a lot of people that say like women transitioning to men, it's very uncomfortable. They don't realize what testosterone does in the body. It is a whole different thing. One other thing with the testosterone numbers, if you look into it and you start Googling, whenever you look at men's testosterone numbers, they're usually pushed as nanograms per deciliter. Whenever you look for females, they are listed as nanomoles per liter, which is essentially the same thing, it's just, but number's bigger.
Yeah, I get you. That's interesting. I wonder why they do that. I wonder if that's because of it being a more done like internationally, and they use per liter in the in the EU. So I wonder if it's just because of that.
Well, I mean, the deciliter thing would match with the liter. I think it's more so because the number looks better in writing.
Oh, like the appearance of it. Ooh,
yes.
Shit. That's fucking crazy.
It doesn't look that they have like a 0.5 nanogram per deciliter. It looks better to say they have 1 nanogram per or nanoliter, nanomole. But yeah, I got you. So I think that to sum up my opinion is I think that in a perfect world, I think there'd be divisions for trans athletes.
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
And if there's a demand for it and an avenue for it to grow, it will organically. If it's truly not about winning, which I don't believe that it is. I know that you mentioned that, like that they're not transitioning just to be successful. That's a lot to go through just for a trophy. If it's truly about being able to participate in your sport and identify how you identify and compete, then going against the clock, against the time, against the record, even if you don't have anyone competing against you at all times, should be sufficient, in my opinion. And it will allow more people to transition and participate because there is an avenue for it.
And finally, the athlete that came across my page that made me start looking into all of this again. Anne Andres, a male to female athlete who competes in the 84 kilogram weight class, had a 275 pound bench press. Unrelated, but I'm not even a powerlifter. I'm in a lighter weight class and my bench PR was 315. Again, I am not a competitive powerlifter. When Miles and I recorded our first episode, we had technical difficulties and I had to re-record it, but I said something in that unreleased episode that I was astonishingly short-sighted on. I said I was worried that people would transition with the pure intent of trying to win. I'm not saying people aren't doing that. I'm certain there are. I was short-sighted because I didn't see how people would use the extremely vague rules, Canada in this case. to protest. In Canada, if you'd like to compete as a woman and you are a biological male, the only prerequisite is to say you are a woman. That's it. And that is where Avi Silverberg, head coach of Team Canada, comes in. See, Anne was talking some shit on her Instagram, saying how bad girls were at bench. And, you can watch this clip.
Why is women's bench so bad? I mean, not compared to me. We all know that I'm a freak, so that doesn't count. I mean, standard bench in powerlifting competition for women, I literally don't understand why it's so bad.
And Avi didn't like that. The 84 kilogram weight class for women is interesting because it's the highest class, meaning anybody weighing more than that is allowed to compete in that class. Avi's a very big dude, and he's a very gifted bencher. And Andres had a 275-pound bench record in the women's category. They have won 8 out of their 9 competitions in the last 4 years. Avi, however, his all-time bench PR is 661.4 pounds. When he showed up to the competition, even though he could bench more than double the current record, he only benched just a measly 100 pounds more than the record at 369.5 pounds, as you'll see in this video. To add insult to injury, Anne was there to watch. Later, Anne posted this video Instagram clip.
Hey folks, just a super quick update. Yes, somebody did show up at the meet today with malicious intent, and you know what? It was nothing. It was just entirely ignored. People lifted, I volunteered, everyone was happy that I was there. And it really struck me that maybe my participation isn't necessarily fair. I mean, there's science, whatever, but people welcome me because I'm actually nice to people. I show up and I try to make everyone happy. And I think that matters a hell of a lot more than people give it credit for. People want me there because I'm actually nice to people. Just a little thought. I'm all good, and the CPU will continue, and be nice to each other. Lift heavy circles.
Thank you, with the situation with that one lifter claiming to be trans just to get those medals and setting records and all that stuff. Here's the problem. You shouldn't really be asking me, because I ultimately, I mean, weird thing to say, I come from a place of privilege, which, like I said, is weird to say. You gotta keep in mind, I transitioned almost 20 years ago. I got all of my papers done. I have my passport. I got surgery. I can prove without any doubt whatsoever that I've gone through every step.
So as you can see, she says, maybe my participation wasn't fair.
Maybe my participation isn't necessarily fair.
Then why are you there? They acknowledge their advantage when saying women are bad at benching. They acknowledge it again here. Why were you there? You being nice isn't making the women you're outperforming happy. There's so many interviews with women who were beaten by male to female athletes, and none of them are cheering or excited. They're heartbroken because years, if not decades, of training are dashed in a moment. This cost them scholarships, accolades, sponsorships, and so much more. Their sadness doesn't go away just because you're nice. This shows us so clearly it's not just about testosterone. Again, in episode 22, which I'll link above, we talked about this. Bone size, shoulder width, hand size. There are so many other factors. Otherwise, once Anne got those surgeries and was on testosterone blockers, they'd have a very similar bench to other women. We have divergence in a sport for a reason. We have natural and enhanced competition for a reason. There are competitions for exceptions to all of these rules that are separate. We have the Special Olympics for handicapped people. We have most improved and best transformation at bodybuilding shows, and we don't look at these people and think less of them for competing in a category specific to them. So why are people so opposed to a trans category? The question I kept getting asked while talking to pro-trans athlete friends was,
why does it matter?
My simple answer is this. Why do you not care that women are being removed and beaten in their own category? And for the people who are going to watch this and scream transphobia, belief is not a choice. I was on the other side of this argument once. I saw data I couldn't refute, and here I am. Data can change many minds back, mine included, if it exists, but I'm sad to say I don't believe it does. I wish I could believe that it was fair because it really does sadden me thinking about people who genuinely don't feel like themselves. I can't imagine what it must be like to be told you can't compete as you would like to, but I just can't ignore what I see. just as many other people can't. Finally, as usual, guys, I'm going to be giving away an Amazon gift card. So DM me on Instagram at AndrewPFM or put this answer in the YouTube comments. Out of 9 competitions, how many did Anne win? I'll be announcing the winner on my Instagram story via randomized or, a randomizer thing the Sunday after this drops. So please like, comment, and subscribe. And of course, before we get to the next section with the disturbing information, I'll leave you guys with this quote. I believe it really suits this topic well. It's from Ryan Holiday when asking someone why people were so complicit with the racism of the KKK.
How did people not know something that was obviously wrong was wrong? It's that their church didn't tell them it was wrong. The newspapers didn't tell them that was wrong. The police didn't tell them it was wrong. Their politicians, it's all these people are propagating this lie.
I'm not going to go fully into this because I will surely get demonetized or at least get strikes, but look up John Money, the man who originally made the claim that gender is a social construct. This story involves castration of an infant, suicide, forced gender reassignment, and something that rhymes with schmedophilia. And sadly, a power-hungry, abusive, narcissistic doctor who lied about all of it, swearing that this study was a success. As for the bit about people needing to transition before age 12, if they want to compete, I believe this is going to force people to transition sooner. Puberty blockers are not reversible. If you disrupt a boy's puberty and he changes his mind, he will have a micropenis. He will never be able to have sexual intimacy as an adult. And if he does decide to transition, because he has a micropenis, there is not going to be enough tissue to make what they call a neovagina. Again, I said this is going to be pretty heavy stuff, meaning they will never be able to fully transition. I'm sorry to end this on such a dark note, but this is the awful reality of this stuff that people just aren't aware of. As usual, I encourage you to do your own research. And with that, guys, my name is Andrew with Pride. See y'all later.
Hey guys, thanks for watching that episode. If you got some value out of that, please give me a little subscribe somewhere in there, whether that is on Apple, Spotify, wherever you're listening right now. And you can also find me on TikTok, Instagram, pretty much everywhere, honestly, at AndrewPFM. So yeah, guys, until next time, we'll see y'all later.